Great, thank you, Lynn. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you to everyone in the audience for being here today and our panelists for participating in this session about description. My name is Marge Huang, and I am the Martha Hamilton Morris Archivist at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, as well as the co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee for the Philadelphia Area Consortium of Special Collections and Libraries, also known as PAXCL. This panel this afternoon will delve into the problematic nature of language used to describe works and collections relating to marginalized people and examine the work being done to address these issues. I will introduce each panelist individually, and they will present for about 10 minutes each. And then our presentations will be followed by discussion and an opportunity for questions. Our first panelist this afternoon will be Dorothy Berry. Dorothy Berry currently serves as the inaugural Digital Collections Program Manager at Houghton Library, Harvard University. Her work focused on the discoverability of African American history and special collections through research, description, and digitization. She is a graduate of the Department of Folklore and Ethnomusicology and the School of Informatics, Computing, and Engineering at Indiana University with an MA and MLS, respectively. She was honored with the Library Journal's Movers and Shakers Award and the Society of American Archivists Mark A. Green Emerging Leader Award. Outside of libraries, her work can be found in JSTOR Daily, the Public Domain Review, and Lawson's Quarterly. Go ahead, Dorothy, thank you.
Great, thanks. So thanks so much for having me on this panel, and I plan to discuss a case study around implementing new descriptive guidelines for racially inflammatory material, specifically collections relating to blackface minstrelsy. Conversations around reparative description in museums and libraries are often focused on engaging constituent communities in descriptive workflows and updating outdated terminologies and controlled vocabularies. This particular case study takes a slightly different tact, focusing on material that in and of itself is inflammatory due to its content. I will provide some background on the project itself, the initial research, and its at Houghton, and two different implementation cases, ending with some project takeaways. Houghton Library's Harvard Theater Collection has one of, if not, the largest collection of materials related to blackface minstrelsy in a special collections library, and views this as an active collecting area. A well-known Black writer visited the collection to research for an upcoming publication, and during a coffee break said to me as an aside, "Who's even selling this stuff? And who's buying it?" Blackface has been a foundational element of American popular culture since its formulation. But as more and more Black researchers are entering our reading rooms, there are more and more questions about the hows and whys of our collecting histories. From 2019 to 2020, I designed and managed a redescription project to address these concerns, titled Descriptive Equity and Clarity Around Blackface Minstrelsy in Harvard Theater Collections. The initial goals were deceptively simple: to identify all the blackface minstrelsy materials related materials in Houghton's collections, to survey the current descriptive practices and create localized recommendations, and finally to provide reference content for future description. So often I have heard from catalogers and processing archivists in response to problematic language in their collections that they didn't know what to do or that no one knows about a particular topic when dealing with both racially marginalized people's materials and racially inflammatory collections. So I hoped that reference tools would quash this common complaint/excuse. Without shared description or access points, and with varying levels of detail in processing and cataloging, it took quite a while to find all the relevant materials. And many relevant materials, like individual sheets and songsters, remained unincluded in this initial project. At Houghton specifically, we identified 226 items with catalog records in ALMA, the catalog for books, so single item manuscripts, publications, periodicals, and complete archival collections. And then within those collections, 3,172 discrete items in archive space across 10 different collections. When it comes to the ease of thematic discoveries, subject headings proved fairly useless. Most frequently used heading, minstrel shows, was used less than a fourth of the time, and then most other top 10 headings were either too broad, like popular music, or too broad to be accurate, like African American songs and music and African American music, both of which were used throughout the collections and both of which have entirely different meanings if you were to actually read the LOC manual. Much more detail exists in the full report for this project, but there were three major recommendations for implementation. The first, a focus on user experience and ease of discovery over library-specific domain knowledge. The second, focus on thematic collocation over format. And finally, focus on description and surfacing of African Americans over timely processing. The most radical recommendation was the first. We had been dividing materials into archival collections, new accruals, single-item manuscripts with their own records, publications, periodicals, because that is the formal structure of our field. Researchers, however, do not approach our collections and our catalogs looking through the formal structure of our field. They are looking for Houghton's blackface material, something that no single search could reveal. The second recommendation looked at our practices that led to these various collections, a collection of carte de visites, collection of photographs of female entertainers. Again, going through the same questions around what assistance we were providing to users. The final recommendation had more to do philosophically with descriptive responsibilities that accompany collecting in this area. Our theater curator actively pursues materials related to African American performers and troupes within the field of blackface minstrelsy, but that information was rarely making it into cataloging records due to the nature of rare book cataloging, and therefore just seeming as though we are expanding our blackface minstrelsy collections for the sake of having more blackface. The recommendation document in hand, I was able to guide 2 implementation projects at different libraries, at Houghton at Harvard and at John Hay Library at Brown. As the recommendations would apply, Houghton's implementation was quite technical on the back end, focusing on intellectual rearrangement and creating a unified access point. The end result was a much larger, format-divided single.
Dorothy, you're muted.
Yep, the host muted me. But so I will start this little slide part again. So the end result for this particular implementation was a much larger format-divided single collection, which meant that we are no longer cataloging new minstrel materials as single items, even if they are rare books. This allows for a highly contextualized archival description in a single spot that patrons can be directed to, and allows us to avoid the issues of needing to focus on proper subject headings, which are not something that users are necessarily engaged with based on the user research. Ethical description is more functional than switching from A to B or the arduous paperwork involved for approving new subject headings. At the same time that Houghton archivist Betts Cope was working on the technical lift to co-locate our materials, I consulted on the project at Brown University's John Hay Library to implement the recommendations in a different way. This project was focused less on intellectual archival arrangement and more on providing context to a pre-existing digital collection of blackface materials. Gemma Brand-Wolf, an undergraduate at Brown, wrote a term paper focusing on her questions around the provenance of Brown's blackface minstrelsy collection, which then raised questions among faculty as well. Library staff, inspired by this curiosity for a collection that had been there since before any of their times, designed a project to rethink the current description for their digital access point and to provide a special collections learning experience for students. This work focused more on consulting, conversation, and increasing student and staff knowledge about the materials and their bibliographic context. Ending with a new site that has a formal introduction from a graduate student and that includes a new data set from Gemma Brand-Wolf that focuses on the African American performers within the collection. They've also reframed the collection from being a collection of blackface minstrelsy materials to a collection that focuses on the representations of Black people in 19th century music. These 2 implementation cases were quite different, but led to some shared takeaways. The first takeaway was to challenge colleagues. This is particularly important with racially inflammatory collections, as in a primarily white field, these collections are often growing and yet ignored. So they are points of pride, but also silent points of pride, which is both inappropriate and also does not assist our researchers. The next is a focus on users and not librarians. bypassing internal descriptive conventions to focus on discovery. So for, like I was saying, many rare books and periodicals are now just placed as accruals into an artificial finding aid that already existed, but now is expanded, even though that is not the structure of how libraries would like to divide up those materials, but that is not necessarily something that has relevancy to patrons. Using accurate language, so throughout these dealings with blackface minstrelsy, we looked to describe the materials plainly and reduce the need for content warnings under the theory that if this material was truly described accurately, we would not need to have any qualifiers. And then trusting outside experts. All of our recommendations and implementations were reviewed and discussed with outside experts in blackface minstrelsy to get their feedback, because they are often our users as well. So thank you for listening to my portion of this panel, and also thanks to all of these colleagues at both Harvard and Brown who contributed to this work, and also Princeton. Thanks.
Thank you, Dorothy. I appreciate your case studies focus on the users. Up next, we'll have Kim Lawson. Kim Lawson is the Research and Community Liaison Librarian for the Indian Residential School History and Dialogue Center at the University of British Columbia. As a member of the Healthsick Nation, Kim worked at UBC's library for more than 10 years prior to joining the center. Prior to joining UBC, she worked as the Archivist Librarian at the Union of BC Indian Chiefs Resource Center. Kim holds a Master's in Library and Information Studies from UBC's School of Library Information and Archival Studies, now known as the School of Information. Her master's thesis, Precious Fragments, First Nations Materials in Archives, Libraries, and Museums from 2004, examined Indigenous perspectives on materials held, organized, and classified in libraries, archives, and museums, and is widely cited in the field. Kim, go ahead. Thank you.
Thanks, Margaret. And thank you, everyone. I want to just say how much easier it is to explore and talk about really different things in the context of all the thoughtful presentations that have come before, and all the thoughtful work that the event organizers have put into creating this space and drawing all of our voices together. So one of the things that's really been important to me in my career is to look at where is room for structural and systemic change. I will say, for transparency, that I've done a very poor job today in acknowledging all the voices and all of the work that have gone before. And I've developed what I hope is a set of touchstones that will draw people into other conversations rather than really provide a summary. And this is my university's institutional land acknowledgement. And I am happy and really encouraged to see land acknowledgements becoming something that is a challenging moment that a lot more people are grappling with. I myself am personally honored and grateful to be living and working on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Hunkaminam speaking Musqueam people. And the Silex people are incredibly generous to my institution as well. And our UBC Okanagan campus is on their traditional territories. We have hospitals and other teaching locations and many other connections throughout the world on other Indigenous peoples' territories. In the context of information professionals, I will often say that land acknowledgements are often perceived to be part of the reparations reconciliation framework, but I've first heard land acknowledgements in exclusively Indigenous contexts where we acknowledge other people's land and when we do business on other people's land. So it's a protocol, and elders take it to indicate that you know your knowledge systems, you know your knowledge protocols, you know what gives it integrity, if you know whose land you're on and how to acknowledge that. And our academic director, Mary-Ellen Turpin-Lafont, Akikwe, is phenomenal and a human rights lawyer. And I could spend the whole 10 minutes drawing connections between her experience and perspectives to the challenges of ethical description. But I will just say that cultural safety and integrity are absolutely critical to the endeavor of ethical descriptive work. So our practices that are normalized and accepted today, many aspects of it can be harmful. And this is an article about Indigenous artifacts that have been treated with mercury and arsenic historically. So it's easy for that to see how harmful it is. And there is a dynamic around looking back at practices. But it is so critical to look at the enduring impact, legacy, and context. So there's many ways to search for and many ways to see and also many ways to hide all sorts of different connections and embodiments of racism that impede or shape descriptive work. And one of the projects I'm very proud of, but forgot to send in my bio, is that I'm one of the authors of the protocols for North American archival materials. And we got together, a group of us, and had some incredibly powerful discussions. And the SAA did not implement them, and privileged comments that clearly reflected really problematic perspectives. And they acknowledged that when they did accept it, and that transparency and that transformation is incredibly powerful. So I won't spend much time on this. I'm sure that a lot of people can easily connect with how many ways problematic description really impacts people and impacts the integrity of our work. Aspects that are sometimes difficult to see that are problematic are just embedded in our regular lives. So if we focus on the format and we focus on literary warrant, what the item itself has to say, then it ignores that broader problematic context and makes findability a whole different challenge. And one of the very powerful tools in our current practice is the acknowledgement that authority for information is constructed and contextual. And that's a very pithy saying, but has so much impact for our descriptive practice, where that wasn't acknowledged or incorporated into our practice in past. And the right of reply is a very powerful framework for looking at how to identify impacts of problematic practices, past and current. So 2006 was when we got together to talk about the protocols. And it's very much connected to what the symposium is focusing on, looking at the conditions when for ethically acquiring and all the other work we do with knowledge, not just objects, but their impact and their meaning. So this is my only real cautionary slide. And for people who are familiar with conversations around performative allyship, there are a lot of mechanisms within academic practices and within the interactions of many types of professions that really misdirect from doing the deep work to look at what the harmful practices that are at the foundations of our professions are, where they are enduring. And many institutions really are primarily concerned with protecting their reputation. And that can be a very unproductive tension with doing the difficult work of finding what's gone wrong and better ways to do things about it. So because Indigenous knowledge is characterized as oral systems, we acknowledge the importance of people and intergenerational connections. Indigenous knowledge is embodied knowledge, and from my Indigenous bias, I can't see how Western knowledge systems aren't embodied knowledge as well. Otherwise, we wouldn't need archivists or librarians. So grief is more than the loss of people. It's the loss of land and language and opportunities. And we count on the Indian Residential School Survivors Society to provide a whole range of supports to help us as human beings who are doing the work and all the people we seek to help. So this is where I'll slow down for a little bit, because it's important to acknowledge that our work, my work at the center, my colleagues' work is inherently traumatic and very much shaped by grief. And this year it became much more intense when the Kamloops Nation was searching for children who didn't come home and found 215 unmarked graves near a former residential school site. So there's incredible power in the reactions to the grief. So this is student art, reflecting on the voices of the 215 children at the one school. And there are many, many more that we've become aware of over this year. We've become aware of the grave locations, but survivors in communities and families have known that children did not come home and have witnessed deaths of children at institutions, in schools which were designed with graveyards. So there's a clear intent. So the providing access, space for dialogue, these are all complicated, crucial aspects of our work that we're really developing. We have a primarily digital collection, and we have many principles that we're looking to really find ways to ground in our practices, or to use to ground our practices. So my main point for everyone today is that we did a lot of work. We developed a lot of data. We being the people before me, because I hadn't started the center at this point. But one of the very first steps in descriptive work was a dialogue series with communities connected to and affected by residential school history specifically. And we center our work with survivors in many ways, including the development of an oral testimonies project and the incorporation of video testimonies from partners like the Legacy of Hope, as well as archival and government documents. So the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People is an absolutely crucial document that's the result of many, many, many hours in conversations. Many Indigenous authors developed this document. And our descriptive work includes visualization. Timelines is one of our key tools to help people see connections which are not evident or visible by looking at the documents themselves. And the UN Declaration and Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, particularly the calls to action, also reflect so many survivors and community members and people affected by colonialism, reaching into their experiences and histories. And I included the document about the UN Declaration written for children as a visualization to show people reaching forward. Without having any Indigenous knowledge, our descriptive work can make the power structures visual, can develop grief and trauma-informed approaches, and we can explore where our practices are not designed to address erasures, gaps, and silences. Indigenous nations are sovereign nations, and that can be a part of our practice that generally is not. And my radical idea is that care has to be a crucial element. Being very alert for anything that dehumanizes anyone in our spaces and circles, and supporting and uplifting each other are absolutely crucial if people are knowledge bearers and we're knowledge institutions. I thank you very, very much for your time and for listening. And I know the question in the chat, I'll send the links to Margaret or to Lynn for them to share out. And I ask that people come to our website and sign up for our newsletter, because I think we're working on some projects that we're not ready to talk about that will really connect to the work of the people in the symposium. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and thank you, Margaret.
Thanks so much, Kim. I really appreciate your point about centering care in your work and the wider context that you shared with us and the systems that are at play when working with Indigenous communities' histories and collections. Up next, we have Violet Fox. Violet is a library cataloging and metadata expert. Her research interests include the ethical implications of classification, privacy and identity management, and the intricacies of zine cataloging. She was previously one of the editors of the Dewey Decimal Classification, and in her current role, she edits the Sears list of subject headings. Go ahead, Violet, thank you.
Thanks so much, Marge. First off, I just want to say thank you so much to the organizers of the symposium for their efforts. I'm thrilled to be a part of this conversation. I'm also going to throw in the script of this presentation in the chat. I know live transcriptioning isn't always perfect, so if that helps, it's right there at that link. I'm going to use my time today. We were asked to talk about a case study, so I'm going to talk about a subject heading that has been talked about a lot in libraries in the past 5 years, which is the illegal aliens heading. Today, I'm speaking in my role as the current chair of the working group on this topic within the American Library Association. I'll talk briefly about the history of this subject heading, which the librarians in the audience will probably know. But this heading was recently changed just 3 weeks ago, in fact, and feedback about the revision has been mixed at best. So I'll focus primarily on the recent changes and what the situation has revealed about the use of the Library of Congress subject headings in libraries around the world and the colonial structures that we work within. The history of the significant debate around this heading starts in 2014, when student activists at Dartmouth College expressed pain and dismay that the Dartmouth Library was using illegal aliens to describe resources in the library catalog. The librarians explained that this terminology was maintained by the Library of Congress, and this was the standard vocabulary in library catalogs throughout the US and across the world. Together, the student activists and the librarians at Dartmouth submitted a proposal to LC to change the heading in 2015, but LC responded and said they would not change the heading at that point. There's a great documentary about this called Change the Subject, and I'd really encourage people to watch it if they haven't. It really centers the people who started this, the student activists, and undocumented people who are harmed by this heading. So later that year in 2015, librarians worked to draft a resolution through the American Library Association, which called the term dehumanizing, offensive, inflammatory, and even a racial slur. And this resolution that was passed in January 2016 urged the Library of Congress to change the subject heading to undocumented immigrants. That resolution was passed overwhelmingly by the ALA Council in 2016. So 2 months later, LC announced that they would be revising the heading, replacing illegal aliens with the terms non-citizens and unauthorized immigration. Unfortunately, following that announcement, Republican lawmakers made multiple attempts to block the revision of the subject heading. Bills were introduced in March and April 2016 that would have required the library to retain the heading, one of which passed the House but was never passed by the Senate. Despite some confusion around this point, the Library of Congress was never forced to keep the illegal aliens heading. The decision to revise the heading has always remained with LC administration. The appropriations bill that Congress passed in 2017 instructed LC to be more transparent in their decisions. So after this pushback in March and April of 2016, LC published a survey in May 2016 and said they'd be reconsidering their decision based on the new feedback. And that was in May 2016, so over 5 years ago. The library profession had not heard anything further from LC. In the meantime, libraries and library consortia across the US have made local changes to this heading. It's important to note that not all libraries are able to do so, either because they can't afford library systems that allow for deviation from the standard, or they don't have the staff to do so, or they're in conservative areas and can't make this change for political reasons, or they're in a consortium and not everyone agrees to make this change. The systems that we're working with are very reliant on standards, such as the LC subject headings. So that's where we were until 3 weeks ago. And on November 12th, LC announced that they would be changing the illegal aliens heading. Everyone was very excited about the announcement until we looked at the replacements. Instead of replacing the term with non-citizens and unauthorized immigration, like they had originally announced they would be doing back in 2016, LC now is replacing the headings to the terms non-citizens and illegal immigration. Why? We don't know. LC hasn't made a statement to explain why these terms are better for our users. In addition, unlike literally every other subject heading revision, which are posted on something called a tentative list before they are enacted, feedback is always requested from the library community on proposals, but the revisions to this heading were announced as a fait accompli. This is how this is going to be. Many librarians were not happy with this process or the choice of replacement terms. Instead of choosing the easily understandable undocumented immigrants or undocumented immigration, they've chosen terms which are still assigning the legality of an action, as with illegal immigration, or with non-citizens using an overly broad, not common word. And again, LC has not made any statement about why they've done this. We can make educated guesses about political pressures that they face, but essentially we're left in the dark. So let's talk about these revisions and how they impact access. Here's an example of a book in the Library of Congress catalog, a middle grade book published in 2020 called Land of the Cranes. Here's what the catalog record looks like today. You'll notice in the first few sentences of the summary, it describes the book as being about a family seeking asylum in Los Angeles. But you'll also notice that the illegal aliens subject heading has been applied to this book. That's even though the main character is in a family detention camp, awaiting determination on the legality of their actions. The cataloger has effectively labeled this action as legal, despite the fact that seeking asylum is legal. The new revisions that I talked about are being rolled out in the LC catalog and in OCLC's WorldCat right now as we speak. So we're in a waiting period to see what this book catalog record will look like in the next few weeks. This is, again, what it looks like today. I'm hoping that if they're taking their time in these revisions, they won't add the illegal immigration heading to this book, recognizing that asylum seeking is legal. But for people looking for works about undocumented immigration, they won't find this book. So in many ways, this case study is not typical. The Library of Congress subject headings have been in existence since 1898. And the 2016 pushback to LC's proposed revision by Congress members was the first time Congress had ever gotten involved in the subject heading process. The typical process of the heading revisions before being proposed to the policy section at LC and waiting 2 months for a yes or no decision, that process was totally upended in this scenario. But this case does highlight the downside of the way we've relied on a government agency to do this work in choosing our standardized vocabulary. A large government organization like LC is by its nature going to be more conservative in its choice of terminology because of an inherent culture of caution. You don't get into decision-making roles at the Library of Congress if you're a radical. An organization like LC will always choose its messaging very carefully, and transparency will always take a backseat to the fear of making waves and threatening its budget. It also illustrates the pitfall of putting all our eggs in one basket. As cataloging departments across the country have been downsized over the past several decades, we have relied more and more on cooperative cataloging and more on standardization. There are fewer and fewer people to make thoughtful decisions about subject analysis, fewer people to explain the value of controlled vocabularies, fewer people to go back and do the reparative work that we know we need in our catalogs. There's more reliance on national libraries and international standards such as LC subject headings, LC classification, and DEWI. There's less flexibility to imagine new ways of doing things. So the solution, in my opinion, is to reverse this trend, to rethink our reliance on standardization. Hire people to do this work in well-paid, full-time, permanent positions. Hire Black, Indigenous, and people of color, people who are not able-bodied, people who are not upper middle class. So the few people who are not in majority roles in metadata work don't have to be the sole voices pointing out the problems with racist, sexist, colonialist terminology. Pressure vendors to create technological systems that provide the option to display local headings. Invest in non-LCSH controlled vocabularies as alternatives, and empower metadata workers to recognize and replace terms that are offensive to their communities. I have so much more that I could say about this, about how the activism of undocumented people and library workers put a spotlight on this heading and push this conversation forward, how library workers have argued that this recent revision to the heading is insufficient in removing dehumanizing language. But I'm really excited for our conversation today, so I'll cut it short there. Please don't hesitate to get in touch if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Violet. I appreciate the overview of this particular case study since it does point out many of the issues in our standards. I actually didn't know about that recent update, and it's very puzzling to hear. But last we have Dr. Kenvi Phillips, who is the Director of Library Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Brown University. Prior to coming to Brown, she was the Johanna Marie Frankel Curator for Race and Ethnicity at Harvard Radcliffe's Arthur and Elizabeth Schlesinger Library on the History of Women in America. While there, she led the library's effort to diversify the collections to be more inclusive of racial and ethnic populations across the country. She has also worked with archivists and curators, both within Harvard Library and other repositories, to develop partnerships to increase access to collections about marginalized people, particularly women. A historian, Kenvi holds a master's in public history and a doctorate in US history from Howard University. Go ahead, Kenvi, thank you.
Thanks, Marge, and thank you to the organizers and my co-panelists for this conversation, or these conversations that we're having throughout the day. I'm in a really interesting position of recently switching jobs, and so selecting a case study that I thought would be appropriate for me to talk about was very difficult. So instead of talking about a case study, I'm going to offer some scenarios and some solutions that were instituted, or some processes that were instituted at my previous employer, Schlesinger Library. I want to acknowledge and shout out Jenny Gottwalls, Emlyn Brown, Laura Pamer, and Kelsey Shepard, who are still at Schlesinger, continuing this good work in some shape, form, or fashion. And I also have to take a moment to shout out the good work that Dorothy mentioned earlier, and some other projects that are happening here at my current employer, Brown University. So with that being said, I want to get started and make a case for, I don't know what I'm looking at, make a case for collective descriptions, and doing this as a group, as opposed to laying all the burden of doing the descriptive work on catalogers and archivists. That's not, okay. My first of two scenarios I want to offer you, because I want to center and remember, as we're talking about these collections, that we are talking about people, we're talking about people's lives, and we have to consider them and how they will receive the information that we put forward. And so the first, in March of this year, the Radcliffe Institute held a half-day program entitled The Stories We Tell, The Objects We Keep, Asian American Women in the Archives, in which the keynote speaker, who's pictured here, Helen Zia, shared a story of when she went to a museum in Alaska and encountered an image much like this one that you see, where there was a description of an automation or of a machine that had a racial slur. There was no context to this image. There was no information. It was just simply this picture and these words. Helen stepped down. She contacted the staff and told them what she thought. She went home. She wrote a letter. She waited over a month until she heard that the image was taken down, and that was it. So in lieu of changing what was happening, creating context, which is what she was looking for, and understanding the backstory, the only image that in that museum that was talking about Asian Americans was erased or was taken down. And so there was no evidence of this particular group being in the museum, which was like almost the exact opposite of what she wanted. She said then that a year later, she received word that there was some sort of change that happened, but it wasn't exactly what she was looking for. So I'm thinking again about, as we're talking about describing these materials, what do these descriptions do? Who do they affect, and how can we be sensitive to those people? Oh, go back. Okay, y'all. Go back. Yeah. The second scenario revolves around this image that you see here. And what happened was, this picture was being accessioned into Schlesinger collections, and it was put forward to some media folks, and the media folks interpreted the image, and they mislabeled the image, and it misidentified the individuals that were in the image. Some of the folks, the owners of the image, or the owners or the folks who the collection belonged to, contacted the library to find out why the picture was mislabeled, and why there was no understanding of how and who would have been identified, and who would have understood exactly what was going on in the photo. And this was something that showed up in news clippings or newspapers, or news magazines, so in a publication. So again, when we talk about the importance of description, and not just access, but the fallout from interpretation, and how these materials are used after they come from our collections. So when we talk about who's doing this work and how this work should be done, the case again for the collective description is not laying on squarely on the shoulders of archivists and catalogers, and relying on those systems. Let's create some systems throughout the organization that you're in and create and get some backup and get some support from folks who understand and know exactly how to address the material. So who should be involved in answering these questions? So you ask who's best equipped to know about the information. That is, who's the subject of the material, where did it come from, and who are those folks? How can you get in touch with the people who created the material? And if they're not alive or are around to do that, then who else is best to know how these materials were created? Then who understands cataloging, archival and cataloging processes and protocols, practices? Who are the professionals? So that's our staff. Who is familiar with current scholarship and projects? So that will be faculty, that will be scholars, that will be filmmakers, artists, activists. Like, who's doing that? Who's doing the accessioning work? Because there are steps and measures. So when the materials come in, what information is given and how is it processed? And then finally, who uses the material and how is it used? And making sure that we're using language that speaks to the folks who are going to actually engage with it to move the information forward. So Schlesinger's response to this was simply to create a whole array of groups and processes to expand where the information comes from and how it was distilled through the organization. First, we want to talk to donors. And so I have here just picture, because I love a picture. And what you see here in these particular pictures are the donor's hands. So literally allowing the donor to still have their hands in the material and to be able to provide information and to provide context about what it is that we see. There are things that they know and that they can provide, information that they can provide, language that they see, words that they'll use that we would not use or we would not know to use, that we can then move forward. There's back information that they're going to know that we don't know. So again, engaging with the donors and making sure that there's some sort of system to get that information down. One of the things that I found at Schlesinger is that as a curator, I will go to donors, I will talk to donors, I will get a lot of information. And then when the collections came in and they moved over to the processing archivists, not all of the information that I gathered from the donors always made its way to the archivists to make sure that they understood what I understood. And so we created a process, created forms and documents and process to actually exchange that information and also put the archivist in contact with the donors, and then also kept the curator in the conversation to make sure that we're getting as much information as we can. Schlesinger also created advisory groups, particularly around marginalized groups. So there's an Asian American Women's Advisory Group that's made up of activists, that's made up of scholars, that's made up of faculty, alumni, who all are engaged with making sure that the stories of Asian American women are being preserved and also are being promoted, and being promoted in a way that is respectful of the different communities and individuals whose lives and achievements are being documented. So making sure you're engaged with those advisory groups and also making sure you get that information from them if you have, and we really tapped in to make sure that we were able to ask them questions. We were able to take their advice and hear their advice and also implement the things that they were saying, right? And so far as we can. We also worked with partners. So there were centers across Harvard's campus. There are centers and other organizations outside of the university that were interested in this particular collecting initiative. And so making sure we're engaged with them, in terms of language competencies, making sure we're engaged in terms of political competencies, and making sure we understand how and what we're doing as we're moving through these collections and as we're describing these collections. And then finally, like, who else should be engaged? All of the staff. So Schlesinger Library is fortunate to have different departments. I know in some places where, who's accessioning, who's curating and talking to the donors and who's describing the collections sometimes can all be one person, but in some places it's not. In Schlesinger, it was not. So making sure that we were tapped into all of the different departments and making sure we're having conversations and engaged and making sure there's an exchange of information across the organization about what was going on and what was happening. In addition to that, there was a forming of committees. One of the committees that was formed around the Asian American Collecting Initiative was to create was to look at description and to look at what types of language is being used, to kind of go through and evaluate what was happening and then create a manual about how to engage and deal with that. We also were able to employ a graduate student who was working on creating essentially a guide or a primer around Asian American events and culture and information that could be or should be generally known, but may not. And so let's get that out to the staff so that there's some basic things that if they didn't study these different cultures before, they have somewhere to start and they know where to start and how to go forward. We want to make sure that as we're doing these descriptions, that there's that you're not erasing history, but providing context. We're providing context and using language that is both accurate and respectful of the subjects and of the people who we're talking about, and providing clarity so that when the user or the researcher comes to engage with the collection and engage with the material, that they are not left kind of floundering or they're not confused about what is there. And as my previous panelists just said, there are some limitations in terms of what we can say, what we can't say, what is protocol and what is right based on archival and library standards. But that's our job then to kind of distill the information that we get from the donors, from the scholars, from our partners to make sure that it fits in a way that makes sense within our systems insofar as we can. I have many other thoughts, but I would love to engage with my co-panelists and the rest of you all and hear your thoughts and your questions about the great works that have already been talked about today. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kenvi. I appreciate your emphasis on not just ignoring the problematic issues, but making sure you're actually providing the right context and like talking to the communities. So folks in the audience, you can feel free to start asking questions in the chat, or you can raise your hand using the reaction button. But maybe I could get us started with the first question. So several of you kind of touched upon this, and it's something I've been trying to grapple with myself, but what is the future of standards in our field? Like, I feel like going to grad school, you know, that was the emphasis, was DACs, Library of Congress subject headings. Like, that was such a focus. And what role do you see that in the future? How can we reconcile having these organized systems of knowledge versus considering how they're forcing people and ideas into boxes?
I guess I would say that something like DACs, the describing archival content as standard, is different than something like a controlled vocabulary. So a structuring tool, which has actually, at the end of the day, finding it's a very few actual required fields other than title, really, title and a main collection description. But things like controlled vocabularies are interesting to me. I have a sibling who works at Elasticsearch, one of the biggest tech indexing firms. And he's always saying to me that it's fascinating to him how some of the biggest things that people talk about in my field have been very much covered and figured out in other fields. And I think that some of our focus on indexing, on, you know, controlled vocabularies and approved headings don't reflect the innovations in indexing. And this is specifically talking in special collections. I know there are differences in other types of cataloging, but I think that a lot of that focus exists still in our field because a lot of jobs are based on it. but I don't know that the technology, especially just around indexing and how people search, needs to uphold some of those old standards.
I might say that I think we don't always have user studies that show evidence of the sorts of things that we're doing, and we don't always have enough people around to question the practices that we're doing. And so I might say that we have to really ask those questions of whether the controlled vocabularies are valuable. There are some studies that say that they are. There's a trade-off, of course, in any vocabulary of the time that the user spends in trying to find all the resources versus the time that the cataloger might spend to use a controlled vocabulary and do subject analysis. So I would say that we really don't have a good grasp on the value of these standards, but the cataloging standards and the classification standards that we use right now, which requires lots more user study, lots more grappling with, what other alternatives we have right now technologically, and recognizing that we have to know what the rules are and what the benefits are before we can break those rules, essentially.
I think I'd say that one of the most valuable things right now, in terms of the potential for transformative change, is understanding what aspects of our standards are connected to reinforcing existing power structures and problematic descriptions, where they're getting in the way of us addressing the integrity of the meaning of the things that we hold. So I think that's a really crucial step. And it's hard for me to understand the real value of the standards without being in a position to see those connections. And if our standards have no room for things that don't make sense to the people who develop the standards, then they're never going to work for Indigenous knowledge. And what is the profession going to do with that realization? And that's a question for lots of minds. I think we can do ineffective things very efficiently, and that's solving the wrong problem. And people really don't like it when I say that. But there's tremendous power across our silos. So the interoperability between museums and archives and libraries serve users when we approach that thoughtfully. And those are productive tensions. And we can do the same with other spheres and areas of knowledge, because taking an archival perspective to context, who is it that would have documented or wrote about or thought about or asked questions about this topic, can be really effective for finding Indigenous knowledge in libraries where the standards and the standardized vocabulary don't. So I have more questions than answers.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm going to pick up some of the questions that are in the chat. So Dr. Kenvi Phillips already answered one. Miriam asked if the advisory groups are compensated, but I was also curious maybe how you did the outreach, or like what was the messaging to them for them to join the advisory groups?
So the Asian American Advisory Group started with some very interested alum, and it grew from alum, and then there was an approach to faculty that would be interested in the project and initiative, and then within that circle of women, they then recommended other people to reach out to, and so then it grew from there. And so it was able to encompass scholars from other universities as well as activists and folks from other walks of life. And so it kind of grew naturally, starting with some very interested and active alums.
Thank you. Another question in the chat. Thank you to everyone for your presentations. My question came to mind during Kenvi's talk, but I would love to hear from others too. What are the best practices for approaching slurs in historical media, such as the example from the Alaskan Museum? Is it appropriate to censor the word itself to mitigate harm to museum visitors who view it while still offering context for the image or text? Thank you.
I'll shoot out something. It reminds me of a moment we had at Schlesinger around a different exhibit, around an exhibit of an African-American woman. And there was a conversation about whether or not to put out some inflammatory material because she was a recipient of a hate mail. So do we put that information out, or do we not? In terms of museums, because museums are in different contexts than archives, and being able to use that material to teach or to actually provide more context to what it is. And in the end, I think we erred for the museum or the exhibition portion on the side of caution and not putting the overly inflammatory messaging out, because it could not be described and put in a context in a way that made sense in the public viewing, but we did not censor it for use in classes and with faculty who could actually engage with that material and with that language and make it make sense insofar as it could.
Yeah, I think the museum context, especially in terms of exhibit planning, as Kenvi's saying, is specific and somewhat separate than a lot of research contexts. It sounds like, even from that example that you shared, Kenvi, that part of the issue was the slur and part of the issue was the lack of proper interpretive material in the exhibit. And I think for me, I am not a proponent of censoring anything for a couple of reasons. One being that a lot, generally in libraries and museums, the people that are making the censorship decisions are people from outside of the groups that they are trying to be protective of, and therefore don't necessarily have the appropriate cultural knowledge. And most people also don't have any sort of scholarly, you could be a scholar for a different group. But, working with blackface minstrelsy material specifically, if I can't share material with slurs or racially inflammatory imagery, then I guess we can't talk about popular culture in the 19th century at all. And, things even like this presentation here, we've digitized a ton of this content, and I don't sprinkle images in decoratively for obvious reasons of sensitivity. But I think that a lot of, at least from my experience in working in special collections, a lot of the concerns about censorship and racist language are coming from the discomfort of white women, the majority workers in the field. Then from things I've heard from patrons, a lot of more patron response I get is questioning, which is then conversation. And that's different. And it's valid to say something is upsetting or something is racist. And then that's a different conversation than we should protect people from this material.
Before I move on to the next question, I don't know if Violet, Kim, anything to add to that? Okay. This question from Sean. One of the themes here seems to be that there is an inescapable tension between the organic nature of language and the whole notion of a standard. In other words, it's not as though there is a one-time fix here, and institutions seem to be prepared to invest in ongoing redescription. How can institutions make sure that redescription is sustained, just something that we do iteratively? Thank you.
It's about money. It's about putting the money where your mouth is, and funding people who are empowered to make these decisions. From a library perspective, there are many calls from library workers to make the standards that we use free, because there are many libraries that are underfunded and can't can't afford the cataloging standards that are used called RDA. Or you actually have to pay to use the Library of Congress, access to the Library of Congress classification, and then access to Dewey Decimal Classification. And so there's a tension that I think that the librarianship hasn't grappled with, of who should pay for that. If there's calls for libraries to have access to that for free, then in the US that probably means that it would be shown, given that task would be given to the government, to the Library of Congress. And as I mentioned in my presentation, there's lots of problems with having government access or governments making that decision. So I think we can definitely say that libraries don't have enough money to do a lot of this work, to do the standards. But then, who does pay for that? And it's got to be down to the institutions to have more funding to do this.
In an ethical context, I think it comes back to some of the conversations that were brought up around repatriation. If we can't, I think we need to look at description as an aspect of ethical stewardship. So as well as protecting the physical aspect, however problematic the concept of preservation might be, we have to look at the meaning, the integrity, the context, the provenance, the authorship. We need to look at all of the aspects of description as an important part of stewardship, just as much as physical care. And there's a lot of criticism within the NAGPRA context where that wasn't done. Things were collected as curios. And I think that parallel criticism can be made when description isn't done effectively and respectfully.
Thank you, Kim and Violet. I have a question from Lynn in the chat. Is there a consortial way to move this forward rather than depending on government entities? I'm curious if any of you know of any examples where maybe a collaborative or collective effort moved things forward.
Well, I think part of that is, again, for me, the thing that would be controlled by the government and the things you have to pay for are access to classification standards. Specific ones, like 2 of them, or, and then of course with copycat, there's all sorts of other things that less funded libraries might need access to. But there are a lot of descriptive guides and vocabularies that are open access already, but they are not Dewey or maybe LCSH manuals. And so I think that gets, again, to me, into these sort of tricky situations of how much, that gets back to funding in a different way of you're really dependent on subject headings if you only have enough money to process things to catalog things at the most minimal level. So it's just getting title and date and a subject heading and then a couple other things. So then the subject headings become really key. And I think much like Kim and Violet are saying, it makes me think of just the total cost of collecting, which is not just that acquisition. So part of it is more money for cataloging, and part of it is shifting that money around. Why do these things need to be cataloged and processed so minimally, so quickly? Because we keep bringing in more things and more things. We have this huge backlog, and that is not necessarily, that's the collecting end that creates that whole circle.
Yeah, and to build off what Dorothy was saying, it is again about funding. It's about if it's a consortium of people volunteering their time, who's paying for them to live while they're volunteering their time to do that? Do they have enough hours in their day to go beyond just their normal day-to-day job and to put hours into consortial efforts? So, we can see that academic libraries often, librarians often have that time. Public librarians usually don't. School librarians usually don't. And so that skews how our standards are built and maintained because of that lack of funding from those quarters. So again, it is really all about funding and what we're willing to pay for it, and who should be making the payment, essentially.
Thank you. I see John Pollock has his hand raised for a question.
Only if there's nothing else in the chat right now, but I think, let me just jump in quickly. Thank you all so much. This is fascinating and beautifully presented. I wondered if I could just maybe take a bit from Violet's talk and Dorothy's to some extent on the subject heading and ask you to all to give your speculations on that other problematic heading, the author, the creator fields. And well, you know what I'm talking about, I think, but how can we think of ways, much more broad-based, inclusive manners of thinking of the creators of our materials in a way that doesn't often, as it's so often the case, push one name to the top of the list, while others, if they're there at all, are somehow sidelined or way down the field, or just generally thoughts on creation, creating, authoring, and how we can sort of acknowledge multiple voices and people in the context of the works we steward. Thank you all so much.
Do you mean like when there's a author, creator, and then there's like other creators or other names listed further down in a record?
In part, I'm thinking of that, of course, sure. I'm thinking of something broader, I guess, too, that Kim might have some thoughts on, but I'm sure you all do, in the context of white authored materials about indigenous cultures, which in many cases include indigenous knowledge and name and creators within them, but our cataloging systems generally never acknowledge. And it just seems to me a kind of problem that we need to move on. Things that we often assign to one author may have many voices that helped create them.
Well, I think for me on this topic, it's a question of, or what my best case scenario would be, is if there were more clarity in our record systems to users of what fields mean. Because I don't necessarily think for it to use, and Kim, maybe you have a different opinion, if it's, a white professor, John Smith, writes a book about Lakota people, which obviously pulls on things he learned about Lakota people. It makes sense to me as he's listed as the author, because he's the one who gave the interpretation and he wrote this down. And that's important for people to know, even if he pulls on that knowledge, he's the one who's doing the pulling. And that's the interpretive tool there. But I think if this is confusing to users, to me, that's better if there was a way to understand why is that there. And this comes up with archival collections where, the creator is the creator of the collection. And that can be confusing to patrons when it's the John Smith collection of Lakota letters and correspondence. And he just bought a bunch of them or he stole them. But this is his name and he's the first name. This is confusing to patrons. And I have often thought and have done work around education on this for students and researchers. But the problem is partially why do we care so much about creators? That's part of an imperialist process. But another part of it is, why don't I tell you what I mean by creator, which is something different than you would assume. There's a lot of assumed knowledge that is not necessarily, like, you could change it or not, but the problem is basically if we don't even know what this means, then that's the bigger thing. And I think this with rare books cataloging all the time of, like a title and an attribution. But if I, not a rare books person, am looking at a title page of a book and it has a really long title, I don't know that that's 3 different things. I'm assuming that the title includes all of the things on the title page because I'm dumb, or I'm just that's not my deal to know about rare books. So I think a lot of more of it could be education than actually necessarily even needing to change things in a big way.
I definitely support the idea of education. I think that's really crucial in this, and transparency. I think maybe one of the things might be on your mind, John, is the challenge of people who self-identify as Indigenous, and all of the complexity around identity and people who claim that fraudulently. So I think that's an aspect of the authority is contextualized question, and relates to that really challenging history of disconnecting Indigenous people from their families and their communities and their language and their knowledges. And I think that's a great topic for conversations within our professions and across our professions and with the public. And I think education is an awesome way to have conversations with people outside of the profession, whether they're directly affected by it or whether it's useful for them to be aware of the complexities. I think one of the things I come back to as an operating principle is to make the complexity transparent, rather than look for things that wrap up a problem. Because in my experience, like with Kenvi's example, it seems to sideline discussions that could lead us somewhere better, rather than really address anything. Is that what you were thinking of, John, or aligned with it? I'm just going to grab a book. I think, oh yes. I'll turn off the Zoom background if I can do that really quickly. The point I'm trying to make with the book you can't see is that changes in other parts of our lives can make a real difference to this. So Wadsey, Cecil Paul's story with Bryony, or as told to. So there are ways that the publishing industry clarifies the roles and the relationships that are more respectful than they've been, than some others are. And that comes down to power relationships in part, and respect and scholarly integrity, and reinforcing things that erase and define expertise away. So cultural humility is a piece of that, and there's parts of that that are in our sphere and our description, and there's parts of that that are other people's responsibility, maybe instead, maybe as well.
Thank you. I'm going to go to a question in the chat from Tricia at Violet and others regarding LC subject headings such as illegal aliens and other language employed in virtual and physical spaces in libraries and archives. Do you know if this type of advocacy is being discussed in MLIS programs in an effort to create awareness at an early career stage?
And I'll just quickly answer it. Thanks so much for the question, Patricia. Yes, absolutely. You know, I talk to MLIS students all the time who are interested in this. I talk to classes and individuals, and I think much more so than there were even just a few years ago. I hope that's, I hope other people are finding that as much the case as I am.
Great. Thanks, Violet. Another question from the chat from Susan. Are there ways to preserve the traces of interpretation and intervention that are made in catalog records over time and make those discoverable to users? For example, if LCSH is updated, the old categories disappear and researchers looking A particular item records have no way to see if or when edits were made. In museums, there may be older or more information about items in the curator's or registrar's office than on the exhibition label, but most viewers don't have any easy access or even know how to ask for it.
And I think that speaks to what Kim was saying about adding complexity to this, really making that transparent, that complexity of these decisions and the history over time. The answer is really right now, no. The systems that we've built are not really built for that. We would have to implement entirely new systems, which is a great idea. It's just not what, say, library catalogs are built to do right now. Even catalogers aren't able to necessarily trace the history of an LCSH as it's changed over time, unless somebody has written about it, or say a bib record, a bibliographic record. Anyone has, the edits are made. Sometimes you can kind of track when that's changed, but most of the time you can't. So it's just that our systems aren't built for that. And I think, as Kim was saying, that really obscures, the iterative nature of this work and the complexity.
Yeah, so also though, I'll say that library systems aren't built for that. So we have now for our finding aids, anytime a finding aid is adjusted for language or a catalog record receives a different subject, some sort of shift like that, there's a processing note that says on this date, catalog record was updated to, depending on if it was, some terrible slur, we're not going to say like, we changed bad word to this thing. But a lot of times we might say something like, a slavery related collection, we might say that we changed to people first language around enslaved Black people or something like that. And I think that really you probably could put a note in a catalog record, but I don't know cataloging rules, and I'm always trying to just say you could do this, and everyone tells me that's not how it works. But I also think that this comes up a lot from within libraries about tracing these words, and what about people that are searching for other terms, and sometimes you can do back-end work. But I also think, as Violet mentioned earlier, without a lot of use studies, that can be a way in which, because subjects are important to librarians and archivists, that feels like something that patrons need to know. But in another way, it brings the question of, if I'm changing language because it was offensive, do I need to leave traces of that offense? Is that to the benefit of users? And I think that that's one of those things where I have an opinion, but I don't know any study on that particular issue of, is it useful for a user to know, oh, this record used to be racist, did you know?
Thank you. I see Rain has their hand raised for a question.
Hi, thank you, everyone. I'm so glad you all agreed to participate in today's conversation. It was really, really great talks from all of you, and I enjoyed it a lot. I wanted to return to the conversation about the creator of works, but in a slightly different context. So one of the collections I work with the most here at Penn is the Caroline Schimmel collection of women in the American wilderness. And by its very nature, most of the authors, almost all of the authors, are women, and many of them are Indigenous people. And I often have conversations with Caroline about how the creators of these works are named. So often with women authors, we see them kind of buried underneath their husbands' names. Harriet Smith gets buried under, Mrs. Thomas Smith, and we lose sight of Harriet altogether. Or with Indigenous women, we have anglicized names that obscure their original names. And so how should we now be making decisions about how to name creators? Who makes those choices? I mean, ultimately in the library world, it is the Library of Congress rules that dictate how people are named. But ignoring that, how in a really good world, how would we be selecting names, and who should be making those decisions?
I think for the Mrs. question, I'd like to point out the great work of our colleagues at the Beinecke, who did a large project to replace Mrs. Mann's surname with women's first names and last names, and a similar project that we did at Houghton based on that work. And also pointing out that sometimes that can just be a truly obscuring fact. We recently were doing something in Houghton's collection, and it was a letter from Mrs. Douglas, Mrs. Frederick Douglass, but it just said Mrs. Douglas, but he had more than one wife. Not at the same time, but it wasn't dated well enough, and I don't know if someone in the past is letting her keep the name. So it's a question of this letter has actually, depending on how the interest level of this letter really would vary on which Mrs. Frederick Douglass it is.
I would just add that Reagan, you mentioned that the Library of Congress rules, and you're absolutely right in terms of the name authority file. There are rules, but I think people don't recognize as much that much more recently the Library of Congress rules have ensured that the preference of the person, the creator, the person being described is the form by which we should describe them, essentially. So old school catalogers might not know that, that might not be what people were trained in, but that's certainly the rules as of now. I'm working on, I was involved in a small working group that has created a document that's to be shared with authors and creators and artists, talking about their rights and how they can get in touch if somebody has described them in a way that's not following in the way that they'd like to be described, for whatever reason. So that's really exciting to see that I think those concerns are being taken much more seriously. Maybe not by everybody, but at least the people in charge in this case are really trying to do the best that they can.
I didn't know about that, and I really love that change. I think that signals really positive things, and I don't have a lot to add other than to acknowledge that very few of our systems at all can carry Indigenous languages effectively. They don't alphabetize the same, and people have expectations that you can have words in a number of different Indigenous language and that there'll be an alphabetical order to it. And there's a lot of things that Unicode gives us the potential to work with a lot of them, but that still means the work needs to be done. And I think that in an ideal world, certainly in my vision of the future, that's just something that can happen and something that people are willing to do. And so many women's lives and names and thoughts about their identity and about the world they're in are quite lost. Cultural leaders tell us that nothing given by spirit is ever really lost. There's some really important things about blood memory and about connection to the land. Wisdom Sits in Places is a beautiful book. So I don't want to dwell on what's lost, but I do want to acknowledge it. And it is something I grieve for. So it's messy, it's complicated, and it's work worth doing. I don't know if that's at all helpful, but that's my take on it.
I would just add to echo something that Dorothy said about something earlier in terms of who the creator is. I think we do have to keep at the forefront how much influence an outside creator is on the subject. Like, so you're speaking to these women and how much of it is actually their voice in their words, in the way that they said those words, and how much of it is an interpretation, because that can change things. And I'm like reminded of the Sojourner Truth autobiography, which was not written by Sojourner Truth, which we took as gospel, and then have to go back and look at it, decades later and say, some of this could not be true, but it was made for propaganda, it was made for a particular reason. And so then who was the creator? All of a sudden that ghostwriter becomes very, very important. And so like, who made that, who didn't make that, whose words and what was the interpretation is so it's kind of tricky, and there's no like, I don't know that you can have a standard or kind of like hard and fast rule of how to do it, but I do think keeping in mind how much influence an outside person is on the main subject of, or the main creator's interpretation of their words and their work is important.
Well, we are about at time, but I want to check in if the panelists, do you have any other final words or thoughts you want to make sure we hear? If not, there will be a break now for the symposium, and the next session will start at 3:30. Okay, well, thank you all to your panelists for your time and all the work that you do.
Thanks,
Thanks so
everybody.
much.